This is Project Healing Waters Omaha Beginning Fly Tying Session 1. Today we're going to be tying the San Juan worm. But before we get started, I'm going to go over a discussion on hook types. This is a standard dry fly hook. It's with dry flies, you want the hook to be able to float with the materials that you put on the hook. You want it to be able to float. So a dry fly hook is normally a very fine wire. Then we have a nymph hook or a wet fly hook. And that's, you can tell, is a heavier wire. That is a little bit bigger size, like one size bigger. But the wire is a heavy wire, and that helps the fly sink better. If you were to try to tie a dry fly on that hook, it'd be real difficult to get that to float unless you had foam or some really high floating materials. If you look at the length of the hook for the dry fly, you want the body to be a nice long straight section. Nymphs are usually a little bit curved, so you see there's a little bit more curve to that nymph hook. This is a 3x long nymph hook. It's the same size as the one above it, but the shank length is longer. And that's for tying different types of nymphs that might have a little bit longer body. Even longer, this is 4x long, and that's considered a streamer hook. That's usually used for bait fish imitations, longer flies. And then this is a scud hook, and it's again a heavier wire, so it can get scuds are subsurface creatures, so you want the fly to be able to sink down low. So in the case of this San Juan worm, we're tying it on a scud hook. So let me switch back to that camera. So you'll see that's the same hook that I used in the demonstration. For the thread, we're going to be using ultra thread in 140 denier. The two main types of thread you're going to see is 140 denier and a 70 to 72 denier, which is 8/0. This is the equivalent of 6/0. There's two different measurements for thread. And there's different manufacturers. But for a fly like this with the San Juan worm, you want a heavier thread so you can hold that chenille down to the hook. The difference in the thread, 140 denier is a thicker thread, so it's obviously a lot stronger. And if you twist it, it becomes even stronger. But if you use a heavier thread all the time, some flies you're going to have trouble with bulk around the head or in different parts of the fly. So for dry flies, you're normally going to use a 70 denier or an 8/0 thread. And for nymphs, a lot of times you're using a 6/0 thread. So one more thing I want to talk about before we get started, and that's the chenille. So for this San Juan worm, we're using what's called a ultra chenille. And there's two different sizes of ultra chenille. There's a heavier, like we use for the San Juan worm, and there's also a smaller size. It's normally called micro chenille. but you can tell that the fibers on there are really dense and close together. When you compare that to a normal chenille, like this brown, you can tell that the fuzz on this chenille is a lot longer, and it's not quite as tightly packed, not as dense. So again, we're going to use the ultra chenille in the larger size for this fly. And this fly was actually quite obviously, it originated in the 1970s by Jim Aubrey for use on the San Juan River in New Mexico. It's meant to imitate small aquatic worms. So we'll get started with a scud hook. And I'm using a red thread because the chenille I'll be using is red. I'm starting it on the hook, and let me show you how to get that started. So I'll take a longer piece of this of this thread, pull it out about maybe 3 inches, lay it against the shank of the hook, and then start a wrap. And you can take a wrap forward, but then cross over it, and then continue crossing over it toward the back. So if you'll notice that tag end, I'm holding it tight at about a 90-degree angle. So as you wrap against that thread, that causes all the wraps to be close together. And because I want to use this scud hook for the curvature, I'm going to wrap it down the bend of the hook a little bit there. And usually if you hold your thread out to the point of the hook, if it's about a 45-degree angle, that's about as far as you want to go. So I'm going to take a piece of this chenille that's about a card length. So you can tell where that's bent around the card. I'm going to go to that bend right there and cut it. And that's about the right length for this size of a hook. So I'm going to start at the eye and measure a little bit longer than the hook. You see where my thumb and finger are holding that chenille. It's a little bit past the bend of the hook. So I'm going to transfer that back to the tie-in point. Take a wrap and hold it tight. And then I'm going to make sure that's right on top of the shank. And I'm going to do about 5 wraps. Make sure that's held down really well. And then trying to do touching turns, because I want that hook shank to be covered with thread evenly. I'm going to go up to about the middle point of the hook, right about there. Hold the chenille down tight, and then take a nice tight wrap. Then I'm going to adjust that to make sure it's on top. 5 more wraps. Then continue to about an eye length back from the eye. And see, that's about where I started my thread. And take 5 more, 4, 5. Then, using my whip finish tool, I'm going to make 4 or 5 turns, seat the knot well, and cut the excess thread. Then I'm going to take a lighter, just a standard lighter, and just carefully singe the front of that. And I'm going to fold the tail up and do the same thing to the tail. And that's the San Juan worm. Now, because the trout's teeth are sharp, this thread isn't going to last very long. So I'm going to take some head cement and run it all along the base of that thread. And that's a finished fly.